Well, greetings, class. We are now on the third and final lecture for week 3, and we're going to continue where we left off last lecture. And kind of as a reminder, I'll kind of remind us where we're at. Let me share the screen with you, so you don't have to look at me all the time, and we'll pick up on the PowerPoint. If you remember last time, we were tracing all the way back here to the evolutionary theory of religion, going from monotheism, animism. We finished up talking about that last time. Now we're going to move on into polytheism and on to that. And so let's go on to polytheism here. Of course, most people know with the term polytheism, the belief in many gods. And this is the idea that the spiritual realm deified with transition from venerating spirits like in animism to the worship of gods. In other words, these spirits became gods in people's thinking. Is the way this theory goes. You do have examples like in Colossians 2 and 18, where Paul talks about, that there shouldn't be worship of angels. So you can see throughout biblical history that humanity at times did not worship the one God. They rebelled and worshiped multiple gods or angels or other things. So, but in this theory, as humanity progresses, gods are seen as vastly superior to the spirits, so they're venerated or worshipped. You can see pantheons of all the gods and goddesses. For example, the most famous is the Greek pantheon in Athens that was there, and you still see the ruins today. There is all these gods are recognized, gods and goddesses, and there is a hierarchy oftentimes that may change at times. But for example, in the Greek mythology, Zeus being the kind of the head god, but a lot of times these gods are based on family connections or things they do, like you get the god of the seas and God of various aspects of nature and so forth. So from here they go to worshiping of these gods. They entreat the favor. You got to remember, if you remember your Greek mythology, you remember these gods and goddesses. They act just like human beings, except they have supernatural powers, and they're jealous, and they do bad things to people. They manipulate humans and they fuss and fight with each other and so forth. Sort of like watching a divine soap opera. But they are seen as more powerful than spirits. Their type of worship here is you're trying to entreat their favor because they're very capricious gods and goddesses, and you don't want to upset them because then they'll really get mad at you and cause you all kinds of issues. They are not considered very loving. They are just considered some kind of power that you need to appease and keep happy. But they are not easily manipulated like spirits in animism, and you don't use magic on them. And so we have to realize that this was a lot of what was going on during the first century when the Christianity was beginning. But you think about them worshiping a lot of gods and goddesses, and they did, but they also were highly involved in seeking occult things, and they are very animistic in their thinking as well. So we want to keep that in mind. And the same today, that there are people that don't believe in God, but they're very animistic in some of the things they do look at on a spiritual side of things. They look at polytheism occurring from animism in about three ways. One is the exalting of ancestors who were of high social status, like chiefs of a group of people, or those who had higher spiritual powers, like a shaman or a witch doctor, maybe. And they get the god-like status. Also, promoting nature and household spirits to divine status is also possible. Um, and you know, in the gods in polytheism, you have a lot of the idea that, well, this god is over this area, and this god is over that area, or over that part of nature, or so forth. Or this is the god of love, this is the god of justice, god of messenger god, so forth, like that. One of the things, the Meru people, they were, where we worked, they were animistic in the sense that they believed that ancestral spirits were highly involved in their lives and around them, and could protect them or could harm them, and you wanted to keep the ancestors happy. And a lot of their culture revolved around that. In fact, just the naming of their children had to do with their relationship to their ancestors. And but on the other hand, they believed in one God. And this God lived on top of the mountains, or at least could be accessed at the top of the mountains. And it was Mount Kenya on the southern side of Meru, and then Mount Nambini on the southern side. And it was thought that you go up to the top of these mountains, and that's where you would offer your sacrifices. And the Meru people, they went up there. Like when we were there at the beginning, there was a big drought going on, and so we saw a procession of elders, both men and women, painted up with white paint, and they were taking a black goat up to the top of the mountain. And we were asking them what was going on, because we were new there, and they said, well, they're going up to the mountain to offer sacrifice to Marungu, which is the name of the one god. He's also called Weniinya, or the all-powerful god, or he's called Marungu Njeru, which is the same as what literally the god of blackness, but that is God of holiness, holy God. And but they would set gourds along the way, and we asked what the gourds were for, and they said, well, there's honey in them. And we said, well, what's the point of that? And they said, well, everybody knows that the spirits, they like honey, and they'll stop and eat the honey, and they won't get up there and bother the sacrifice. So you can see there they have the idea of one God, but at the same time, there's a lot of animism involved. The location at the top of the mountain is always where there's water, and it's associated with fertility and ability to have water, which is needed for survival. So that's another way, promoting nature or household spirits, divine status, personifying abstract principles. So God of justice, God of love. It doesn't necessarily have to have an image, but generally does in polytheism. All right. Next stage, one that you don't hear about a lot, henotheism. And this is where people believe in many gods, but they worship only one of them. And they kind of raise that one to the level, this is our God. This is the God that's the one that protects us, and the one we will spend most of our time worshiping. It doesn't mean they don't believe the other ones exist. They just center on one. A good example of this is the goddess Artemis when Paul was teaching in Ephesus, and this patron god of the city of Ephesus was Artemis. And you can, if you read that story there in Acts, the makers of the idols, they make silver images of the goddess, and they would sell it. Well, Christianity was growing, and people were not going to the temple as much, and it was messing with their business, and they created a riot there. And that's an example of henotheism. This one God is set above the others because it's the God that protects them. So uh, these gods have geographical significance, ruling over certain areas or over certain elements as well. And so you may go to another city and they'll have another god or goddess over that city and so forth. And that's their hope, is that by appeasing that God will particularly protect them. All right, well, that brings us to the fifth level of that pyramid we saw earlier, and the evolutionary theory of religion, monotheism. So the view of this evolutionary theory is, okay, humanity's progressed, now they moved past polytheism to something better, monotheism. And in this, of course, people believe only in one God. If you look at how they look at this, they say, well, this began with Moses and his interaction, as bringing the Jews out of captivity of Egypt and writing down the commandments. But we know, if you go back to biblical history, that God was, there's more to the history than that. And, you have God creating humanity at the beginning in Genesis 1 through 3 there in the beginning of the first man and woman and so forth. And you always see God interacting with his creation, and even though his creation rebels against him and doesn't act the way they should, God is still working for their benefit. But God alone is God. And but we also see very quickly that humans began to elevate certain things to the godlike status and begin to worship those things instead of the one true God. But in the biblical text, we see God alone is worthy to be worshiped. And since he is the only true God, and he's the source of moral directives, and you see him giving moral directives and giving guidance to humanity even before, the giving of, quote, the 10 Commandments, which were actually, if you read through there, you'll see that, the 10 were kind of a summary, but that there were actually 619 of the laws. And and that was to help give moral standards and guidance to how to live better from God. There are other supernatural beings, but do not that exist, but they're not gods. And the Bible is very clear that that there is God, Christ, and Holy Spirit, but there is also angels, cherubim, seraphims there, and so that's part of the spiritual realm. And of course, angels simply means messengers, like they act as God's messenger as he wants to use that kind of form of communication. Well, so if that's the fifth level, then if the theory of evolution, religion is true, where do we evolve after that by what they're saying? Some have suggested Zen Buddhism, which I don't think is a real improvement. If you think about it, Zen Buddhism is contemplation by personal insights until you gain what you do it all by your own will. So it's you have to be able to meditate well enough to gain those insights that will eventually lead you to release from this cycle of reincarnation and so forth. I don't see how that could be considered much of an improvement, but that's been some people's thoughts. But a lot of people believe secular humanism would be the next stage, or scientism. I make a big difference between true science, which is using the scientific method and gaining insights and making theories from observing the world. I think that's true, and we saw earlier in the first lectures that both people with an open worldview and a closed worldview can do the scientific method, and that's legitimate. But it doesn't mean that the spiritual realm doesn't exist. So this next stage, if it's secular humanism or scientism, it basically means you don't really believe in a God, only the physical world exists. And that they say, well, that would be the highest thing. So you really elevated humanity to that position, if that's the case. So you note here I say on scientism, unlike the use of scientific method as only one mode of reaching knowledge, scientism claims that science alone can render the truth about the world and reality. And that's because you said, well, it's only the physical world that exists. But even there, remember we did that perception stuff at the beginning of the class? Our perceptions are limited. We can't see everything. We're limited by our location, our knowledge, all kinds of things. And so even that in the physical world is limited. But scientism's single-minded adherence to the empirical or testable makes it strictly a scientific worldview. And in doing that, scientism sees it necessary to do away with most, if not all, metaphysical, that's spiritual aspects, philosophical, religious claims, as the truths they proclaim cannot be apprehended by the scientific method. So anything to do with philosophical, spiritual, religious claims, they can't be considered because you can't apprehend them can't understand them with the scientific method, and that's true. God can't be understood with the scientific method. Now we can use our reason from what he's communicated and make sound judgments and decisions on what's real and what's not. But in essence, scientists will see science as the absolute and only justifiable access to the truth. And so I would say that most people, if they follow this idea, that that's what they would consider. And certainly a lot of social scientists believe that was the direction the US was going. They were saying this back in the 1970s and writing about it, but by the 1990s, they realized they were wrong, that this hasn't turned out to be the case, that we are still globally a very religious in our thinking. And so in essence, this theory really, and we're going to see some criticism of it in a moment, but it just doesn't fit with reality, and we'll see that. All right, well, so just to summarize a little bit, we talked about the subjective psychological approach. This means, we've seen people say, well, from our dreams, we develop the idea of God, or we need a father figure or an idealized self-image, feelings of dependence, subconscious feelings and dreams, all of these things, they work in our minds, and we kind of create God. That's the idea. So that makes humanity the creators of God. The evolutionary approach that starts out with, primitive humanity believes in this mana, this vague spiritual power pervades everything, to animism, where there's spiritual beings, ancestors, or nature spirits, or so forth, as humanity develops further. And then polytheism comes next by elevating the spirits to godlike status. Then henotheism, selecting one god over the others to worship. And then, of course, monotheism, but it still leaves us, where does it go from there? But again, there's real problems with this, which we'll discuss here in a moment. But the one we're going to follow in this class is that there is one true God revealed to us in Scripture, and God has throughout human history, and that's what we see in Scripture, examples of this, of God giving us revelation, revealing who he is, what he wants, what's good for humanity. And, and he's revealed himself not only with actual communication directly from himself to people, or through prophets or the early heads of the household and disciples and apostles and then ultimately in Christ, most of all. But he also reveals himself in the world around us, in nature, and we can see, his handiwork there. And we're created in the image of God, which gives us that self-awareness that there's something beyond ourselves. And that's why that religious nature is just there. And I think that was created within us from God, as he was the one that created us in his image. And in some sense, that has to include a notion that there's something beyond just the physical world that he put under the care of humanity. So if you look back in Genesis, he made humans the custodian of this world, which means we should take care of it, do things that are good for its benefit, just like we should do good to all people and serve people. All right, well, criticisms of this evolutionary theory of religion. First of all, it's never been seen to work exactly like this. Changes occur both ways on that scale. There's plenty of places where you see monotheism is there, and then it evolves into polytheism or animism, or even that way. And the first two stages, like mana and animism, oftentimes, like the people we worked with in Kenya, Meru, that they had animism, but they believed in one supreme being very strongly. And and when we shared the gospel with them, and they say, "Well, excuse me, sounds like our God, Marungu," and truly there were a lot of similarities. And then they learned more about who Marungu is, and the sending of his son Jesus and things. They said that fits with everything we've known, and so as a result, the animism starts to drop away as the source of power, but God becomes the main source of power. Many traditional cultures show ties to monotheism. And this we'll talk about more in a moment, but it's very important because the truth of the matter is that most groups in the world have some understanding of monotheism in their religious background. So both the subjective, psychological, and evolutionary theories have something in common. They are bonded into a closed system, like we talked about in the first lecture: the open worldview, closed worldview, open system, closed system. And the subjective psychological approach and evolutionary approach basically are saying there is not really a spiritual dimension. They both contribute to the idea that we already live in a world without windows. This is Peter Berger, who's a sociologist, wrote, that this is a perception that our world is totally physical, and so it has no windows. There is not a spiritual dimension. And so this view leads to secularization of cultures and societies, leaving God out of the picture totally, and the spiritual dimension and the religious dimension of humanity. So both make God, religion, spirituality a human invention. It's just coming from our minds, and like an evolutionary, there's the idea, well, we start thinking, and we get a little more sophisticated in our thinking. Eventually we'll get sophisticated enough that we realize there really isn't a God, and it's it's all up to us, and we only have a physical world. And but what you really see in reality, these two views merge, and so they're kind of bound together. So evolutionary would take in a lot of the subjective psychological things and say that's what's occurring at each of these stages. One of the best criticisms of this view comes from Wilhelm Schmidt, and he studied linguistics. He went around the world studying different cultures. In the end, he wrote a 12-volume series translated into English. It's The Origin of the Idea of God. I think it just recently got translated into English. Um, but he documented reports of traditional religions and cultures that referred to monotheism. So he went looking in their background of their religion in various ways and realized that if you go back, and even if they're not monotheistic now, they're animistic or they're polytheistic. He was saying there is back in its history a monotheism there. And so more likely, he says, you get it devolving instead of evolving. They had that, but they've gone away from it. And that's what we see in the Bible also. He documented many traditional cultures that have most of the basic monotheistic beliefs. And we'll talk about what those monotheistic beliefs are, a kind of a list of them. He said, it's summarized this way: virtually every religion carries a vestige of monotheism that can be identified as a variation of the 9-point description. And we'll talk about that 9-point description in a moment. But in other words, Schmidt found this idea of one God in these cultures. And so he came to the conclusion that most, if not all, cultures started with monotheism and devolved into various different things. And I think that fits more with the reality we see in cultures than the evolutionary theory idea. He points out a number of traditional cultures practice little or no magic, but believe in one creator, God. So that's a big criticism of that approach. So 3 basic inferences from the original monotheism model. So when we talk about monotheism as the other approach to religion, we want to keep in mind there is one clear change moving away from monotheism, particularly in wealthier countries or societies. We see the moving of secularism, science having all the answers, but the spiritual things being pushed out. We do see some of that, but it's still a minority of the US population for that matter, but also of the world population. But you do have systems out there, political systems that push secular view of life. Any communistic systems are very much like that. But still, the world is notoriously religious. Ritual and magic become prevalent as people move away from monotheism, as seen in our present modern world. This new age we have, and people getting crystals, and they look at saying there's a spiritual presence in the woods, especially virgin forests and things like that. And you have all of that kind of stuff, and you can get reincarnation involved with that. Even some throw in some aliens, but we see this also happening in the Bible, where people rebel against God, and they develop new God, multiple gods, and so forth. But we also see God's always working to draw people back to Him. The Old Testament prophets calling for a reform to get away from worshiping the gods and goddesses, or doing following magic and occult stuff. So monotheism calls for the world with windows, humans as both physical and spiritual beings entwined. It's an open worldview, and being capable of both physical and spiritual relationships. And this shouldn't surprise us, and there's nothing really negative that should be about it. I mean, there are Christians that don't behave right, and you wonder if they really are Christians, but on the other hand, no humans behave right. They're always doing things that aren't right, but Christianity gives people a direction and guidelines, and is very clear that God knows we're sinners and we need help, and that's why He presented Christ as an answer to that. And so, despite the fact that there is a push towards a secular understanding of humans, it really doesn't really bring the betterment of humanity. And we can see this in the 20th century as things went on. You had the Holocaust during World War II, after World War One, and it's just, and we've seen genocide in nations here and there, and oftentimes this genocide is working around, the view that the world is a world without windows, doesn't have spiritual dimension. We think about the Germans and the genocide against the Jews. 6 million were put in the various camps and put to death in various ways. And that was only 6 million. There was another couple million that were not Jews, but they were people of, a different culture, or, politically against Nazism. But if you look at the communist system in Russia, Russia killed well over 10 million people to put their system in place, and China killed close to 20 million. And you just got to, and they're secular systems. So when people criticize some of the things that in the history of Christianity, yeah, there are times when Christianity doesn't act like it's supposed to and hasn't. But it's nothing compared to a secular system. And at least we can look at and say it's not right, where the secular system says, well, if it works for our benefit, it's okay. Because after all, there's only a physical world. Who's going to tell us who's right and wrong except us? All right, well, so in the monotheism model, it starts with the original monotheism. Then you have monotheistic traditions that develop from the original monotheism, which Islam would be an example of that, or Zoroastrianism. But it decays also into areas of magic and ritual, mana, animism, polytheism, and Hinduism. And so this is the idea of the devolving as opposed to that evolving system we saw earlier. Well, so when we think of monotheism as the source of religion, it begins with a God who reveals himself in history, and humanity responds to his self-disclosure and produces religion. And God prescribes the way of doing the rituals and what he wants to see. And that's why in the Old Testament you see him describing, when the Jews set up the worship with the tabernacle, it's very specific about things. But even before that, Adam and Eve leave the garden, but he provides a sacrifice system, which you see Cain and Abel, which Cain doesn't follow the instructions, but Abel does. And we know what happens there. But in that, we see what's called the 9-point basic beliefs of monotheism. And so when people look back, like Schmidt did and stuff, he would look back and say, do they have some idea of the one God monotheism with these points? So one God, some have various levels of relationship. Like in Christianity, it's a very personal relationship between God and humanity. Islam, on the other hand, not much of a personal relationship involved in that. God's not actively involved in your life like we see it in Christianity. God is described with masculine qualities and grammar generally. And even though we know, God in and of himself is either a human man or a human woman, but that's how grammatically he's described. God lives beyond the created world. God's at least extremely powerful and knowledgeable, if not all powerful and all knowledgeable. He created the world. I've been involved with a good number of African traditional religions, and almost all of them would say, oh yeah, God created the world. So God sets the standards for what's good and evil, and then humans are God's creation, subject to his standards, and humans are alienated from God by disobeying his standards. And then finally, God provides the way for humanity to be reconciled. So, and this is what we see in the Bible, but you can see this in other religions, and a number of them have some of these, and if some of them, all of them. But anyway, it's good to know the 9 points. I'm sure you'll need to know some of these at least for an exam. So if we talk about God and humanity from the monotheistic viewpoint of Christianity, God is very relational. He creates humanity to be in a relationship with Him, with each other. He's called God is love. Love in and of itself is showing that relational aspect. And we see God interacting and communicating with humanity and asking for responses from us. And it's God who takes the initiative first. And He's personal and He's involved. He's not some far off and not concerned with humanity. All of the Bible shows how He's concerned. He always acts for the benefit of humanity now and eternally. And, the gods and goddesses, you had to make them happy or they mistreat you. God is always working for what's good, even though we don't always understand it or see it or recognize it. But that's who He is. And He sees perfectly and fully. We as humans are limited in our perception, even in the working of God. Now, He reveals a lot about Himself in Scripture, and through that we can learn things and help us to understand what's happening in the world around us. But we're always going to be limited in our perception, especially of God. Then on the humanity side, we're created in God's image. As He is, He's a relational being. We're relational beings, and we have that vertical relationship with God, and we have horizontal relationships with each other. And it points out that God has given us custodianship of the world, so humanity is responsible for keeping the world, and we should be people who care about what we do with this world. Environmental responsibility would be in part of that, and things. But He put it in our hands because we are the ones created in His image and can take care of it. We're created with an eternal nature, and the Bible makes us clear that there's a spiritual dimension to us, and that is eternal. Created and directed to seek the welfares of others. He's given us direction in life, what our life should be about, and we'll talk about that more as we go along. So, just some questions that come along with an open worldview that a closed world view can't really give an adequate answer to. And this is Christianity can answer these key questions of life. And really, a secular worldview or closed system can't, because if we're just a closed system, we're just molecules and atoms bouncing around, and we've actually just finally come to be these human beings. So it can't answer really why we're here. It just happened, a big bang and evolution, and there it happened. So why I'm here, what should I love? Scientific method can't give you that answer. What should I live for? Can't really give you that answer. And what's after death? Certainly can't give you that answer. Can't be apprehended. So it's not empirical. So if each of you need to be able to answer this question, I know this will appear on the exam, these 4 questions. I'll ask you to tell me the 4 questions. Then I want you to give me your answer. I'll give you mine. Why am I here? To live relationally with God and represent His love, which means relationship with other people. What should I love? God, others, and self. That's based on the 2 greatest commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. What should I live for? God's desires and others' welfare, which I think sums up what God was about. And then what is after death? That is life eternal. And and we need to remember, besides the greatest commandment, it points out that for God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. God's love for the world is shown preeminently in the sacrifice of his son. The best humans can show that, even that people, some humans can even risk their lives for others or a family member because of their love for that person. But I've seen, there are cases where people who don't even know someone risk their lives to save them. So it's the ultimate showing of love. And then Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Well, just a couple more things here. We're going to get into a fuller description of, of what we do, what our, in our relationship with God, how should that be shown in how we reach out to the world around us? So there are important criteria for sharing the gospel to those in other religions or that are just secular. First is to live by the greatest commandment: love God and love your neighbor. If we mistreat people, they're not going to listen to what you have to say, and they're certainly not going to have a good view of Christian perspective. Follow the golden rule: do unto others as you want them to do to you. So treat every person and their religion with respect, or their lack of religion. And as Paul put it, live in peace with all people so long as it depends on you. And in Paul's journeys and his sharing the gospel, we see him practicing this. You can learn from other people, their understanding of their own belief system, their religion, or secular ideology. We can theoretically talk about them, and within every religion, every philosophy, people have different perspectives. So it's good to hear them personally so you can engage with them. We see we should look for points of contact. We see this with Paul when he's preaching on the Areopagus, Mars Hill in Athens, and he points out, hey, I noticed that you are very religious, he says to these philosophers, because I saw your statues to the gods and goddesses, but I noticed this one to the unknown God. And from there, he shows them respect for what they do believe, but he says there's more. And and he shares with them who this unknown God is, the one true God, and about Christ. And so we see this being done by Paul. But you can also, as you get to know what people believe, you can note obstacles to beliefs that you need to further explore. But be sure not to let your own cultural bias obscure or supersede the gospel message. Sometimes when we talk to people with other religions, we may get our culture mixed in with our gospel, and we don't want to do that. But you do want to make the gospel intelligible to the people you're talking to. As Paul put it, I'm all things to all people. And, so he recognizes the need to interact with people personally to understand what they believe, but to not let his culture get in the way, which would have been a Jewish culture. All right. Well, that's the end of this presentation and the final one for this third week. And so please continue to do well on your assignments, and we'll continue to interact online. Take care. Have a good day.